It's a legendary part of the American past, the job that created the cowboy. It's the heart of the food chain, the business of eating and being eaten. It's as old as farming and as current as cloning. An industry in which a single bull can sire 100,000 calves. Now, cattle ranches on Modern Marvels. The image of cattle ranching in America is still a traditional one, full of open spaces, big skies, large herds, and cowboys. But cattle ranching today isn't really about cowboys and countryside. It's about meat, the very serious and intensely competitive business of putting some 25 billion pounds of steak, barbecue, and hamburger on the national grill each year. Never have the economic stresses and demands been so great. Never have ranchers been forced to speed up and streamline the very cycles of nature, to push their cattle quite so hard, to grow them so big, so fast, so meaty, so uniform, using everything from sonograms that analyze the genetic quality of an animal's flesh, to computer chips that carry growth and weight statistics stretching back for generations, to fertility pills and embryo transplants that enable a single cow to conceive as many as 36 calves. All this in an effort to make cattle ranching as efficient as an assembly line, and to woo consumers with consistently tender steaks. In cattle ranching, the Old West is butting up hard against the 21st century bottom line.
Used to be, you'd put a cow and bull together, have a calf, sell the calf, make money. It's not like that anymore. It's pretty high tech. You got to do it correctly or you're out of business.
Meet Broadway, a prize Simmental bull with the kind of genes that cattle ranchers around the world have come to covet. Broadway is a seed stock bull, which means he isn't destined for the slaughterhouse like most cattle. Instead, he'll spend his life siring hundreds, perhaps thousands, and possibly tens of thousands of calves. Calves with the right stuff from both a consumer and an industrial point of view. Broadway won't actually mate with tens of thousands of cows. Because of his superior genetic makeup, his semen will be collected and sold in straws over the internet for $200 apiece, and then used via artificial insemination in ranches as far away as South America, Europe, and Australia.
This is a good example of a high-quality red Brangus bull. This particular bull has been leased by American Breeder Service. There's been a tremendous amount of semen collected on this bull, and the semen sales on this bull look very good in the future.
Top bulls can generate as much as $150,000 a year in semen sales. Super bulls with extraordinarily desirable traits can sire upwards of 100,000 calves, so many that they'll actually alter the genetic makeup of their breed. In other words, the entire breed will take on the traits of a single sire.
You just don't hardly pick up an Angus pedigree today that doesn't go back to the Traveler bull or the Scotch Cap bull. I mean, those bulls were used extremely heavy for many, many years.
An increasingly important part of cattle ranching in the 21st century takes place in the lab, not the ranch. Elgin Breeders in Elgin, Texas, has been collecting and storing bull semen since 1954.
This is the semen storage room. There's approximately 5 million straws of semen in these tanks. This represents almost 40 years worth of collection activity.
A single tank holds semen samples for 1,000 bulls.
These tanks are exactly like a large coffee thermos. They're double walled, they're vacuum insulated. If you look real close, you can see the liquid nitrogen in this tank. It looks just like water, except it's quite a bit colder. You'll notice that these semen canes are stored vertically. 5 straws at the bottom, 5 straws at the top. There's approximately 100,000 straws in each one of these large tanks.
In the semen collection process, a bull is stimulated with surprising ease by simply walking behind a mount animal for a few seconds. The mount is another bull, a steer. That is a bull that has been castrated. A steer is used instead of a cow to prevent the bull from penetrating the other animal and picking up any sexually transmitted diseases.
The collection technician will approach a bull that's already been stimulated. The bull will mount the mount animal. The technician will step forward and actually grab the bull's penis. He'll divert that penis into the collection apparatus. The bull will thrust, he'll ejaculate, and he'll return to the room with that collection equipment in hand and also a sample of semen contained inside it.
New bulls learn how to go through this procedure by simply watching their more experienced counterparts.
They're moaning and groaning, their ears are propped up, they're sniffing on each other, sniffing the ground. They're actually being turned on by what they're actually seeing.
The semen is immediately evaluated for density and motility to determine how many of the billions of sperm in each sample are alive and kicking. It is then divided up into as many as 200 doses, or straws. Most straws sell for $15 to $25, but sometimes the price is much higher.
Depending on the circumstances, we have seen semen sell for $1,000 or $2,000 a dose. That real expensive semen results from a bull that is a true breed changer and then passes away at an early, untimely period. There's a finite amount of genetic material on storage, and it sometimes turns into a bidding war just to get your hands on that last little bit of that special bull.
Genetically desirable cows are also being subjected to state-of-the-art breeding techniques. This cow has received fertility drugs that triggered multiple ovulations. Artificial insemination resulted in a harvest of 3 dozen fertilized embryos, which are being flushed out through this tube. The embryos are carefully transferred to a sterilized dish. That's right, the living embryos of 36 head of cattle are floating in this petri dish. The embryos are examined under a microscope to make sure they're healthy, and then put inside an injection gun and implanted into receiver cows who have been biologically synced up so that they are at the same stage of estrus as the ovulating cow and therefore ready to carry an embryo. The R.A. Brown Ranch is a seed stock ranch in Throckmorton, Texas. A seed stock ranch doesn't raise cattle for the slaughterhouse. Instead, it develops superior bulls and cows that other ranches use to develop their herds. Most seed stock ranches today rely heavily on embryo transfers and artificial insemination in their quest for the ultimate bull and cow.
We need to be 5 or 10 years looking ahead to where the industry's going. And if we don't stay out on that cutting edge and be prepared for where the market's going to be, then we don't have the product to sell our customer to help him obtain the highest price he can get for his cattle.
There is no natural selection between the cows and bulls on the Brown Ranch. Incredibly, every animal here is match-mated to its ideal genetic partner. The pairings are based on an extraordinary amount of data that the Browns maintain on their cattle. Each animal is weighed, measured, and sonogrammed at regular intervals to determine its all-important growth rates, as well as the internal composition and marbling pattern of its flesh. When they're a year old, the bulls are even measured for the size of their testicles. Testicular size in bulls has a direct relationship to semen quantity and quality.
The bulls that have below 30 centimeter testicles at a year of age are then castrated and gone on to the feedlot to make beef.
Detailed family trees on these animals are maintained through 6 generations.
There is such a high correlation in the genetic makeup of an animal that they pass on to their progeny. So if our goal is to provide that superior protein, that nutritious, safe product for you, we've got to be able to get a handle on where it came from.
All the numbers are crunched by computer to come up with an animal's expected progeny differences, or EPDs, which profile the kind of calves a cow or bull is likely to have. Evaluating EPDs and match-mating cattle are the core chores of cattle ranching at the Brown Ranch.
I think people in the cattle industry don't even understand how much of a degree that we go to, how many hours that my father-in-law and my husband spend identifying sire lines that have superb traits. They'll actually take an individual cow and look at what the calf might be if it were mated to this bull, and this bull, 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 different bulls. And then they'll choose the best combination.
The matings are diagrammed on a chalkboard in the ranch's artificial insemination barn. Semen from over 500 bulls is stored in the AI freeze tanks.
We look in on our breeding sheets and figure out what bull that she is plan mated to. It's neat to see a calf on the ground that you know that that's the cow that you AI'd. It sure, it makes, you can just see what you've done.
Such high-tech breeding is light years away from the ranching world of the 19th century cowboy. Up next, the origins of cattle ranching in America and the legendary cattle drives. 95 to 99% of all bulls are terminal. That is, they are castrated, fattened up, and sent to the slaughterhouse as adults. Cattle ranches will return on Modern Marvels. Cattle ranching in the United States, especially in the West, has always been famous for its spectacular spreads. But giant ranches no longer dominate the industry. Indeed, only 55 of the more than 800,000 cattle operations in the U.S. have more than 5,000 cows, and the average American rancher has less than 100 head of cattle. While Texas, Wyoming, and a handful of other western states have major cattle industries, fully half of our beef comes from east of the Mississippi, from farms where small herds of 25 to 50 cattle graze on land that once bloomed with cotton. Florida, with its heavy rainfall and rich grasses, has a tradition of cattle ranching that goes back to the 16th century. And Hawaii, of all places, is home to one of the largest cattle ranches in the U.S., the 225,000-acre Parker Ranch, which has been raising cattle since 1847. Humans first began domesticating cattle as a food source more than 6,500 years ago. The Egyptians were among the first to raise cattle, for milk as well as meat, and they kept careful records of their livestock as early as 2625 BC. Columbus brought cattle to the New World in 1494, and the Spanish introduced the Longhorn breed into Mexico and eventually Texas in 1598. The word ranch comes from the Spanish word rancho, which means home or headquarters, and it was the Spanish who brought the fundamentals of cattle ranching to the New World.
On the one hand, they bring cattle to the New World, the source of food, if you will. They bring horses to the New World, and they also bring their culture to the New World. Spanish riding and herding traditions that come from Europe, from North Africa, and elsewhere are transported to the New World, and they spread from there.
The Longhorn flourished in the rich grasslands of what would become Texas. And by the early 19th century, millions of cattle roamed the territory, free for anyone who could gather up a herd. Tom Saunders' great-great-grandfather brought his family to Texas in 1850.
When they got to Gonzales County and started ranching, they got to catching cattle. You could just get as big as you wanted to get, or as big as you're tough enough to handle.
During the Civil War, Texas supplied the Confederacy with beef. But when Northern armies took control of the Mississippi, Texas cattle had nowhere to go. The Longhorn population exploded. At one point, cattle outnumbered people in Texas 8-1. After the war, a meat-starved population drove the cattle market through the roof. A Texas steer worth $6 at home could fetch $40 in Kansas. Thus began the great and legendary cattle drives. a truly epic chapter in the history of American ranching. The cattle drive was a kind of ranch in motion. Typically, it lasted 3 months and involved 12 to 15 cowboys who pushed a herd of 2,000 to 3,000 cattle 1,000 miles or more from South Texas to the railheads of the North.
It really was an amazing feat. And 8 miles a day was about an average of how far they could go. And so it took them months to get there. And of course, in the spring, the rains would swell those old rivers, and they'd get out of banks, and a lot of lightning and thundering and so forth.
Roughing it, to say the least, was a way of life for cowboys on a drive.
You might spend 24 hours horseback, and a lot of them got good at sleeping in the saddle. Had to. If you hit dry country, and it may be 15, 20 miles up there before you could hit good grass and water, then you had to push those cattle straight on through in one stretch.
A rolling kitchen called the chuck wagon provided occasional creature comforts on the drive.
The chuck wagon, usually driven by a cook or the cook's assistant, was sort of key to keeping the men happy. Men wanted to work for ranches that had the best cooks. And a chuck wagon that was well equipped with all the basics, beans, coffee, and flour for biscuits, was an essential for the drive.
Among the many dangers the cowboy faced, none was greater than that of the stampede.
You're talking about nearly 300 years that these cattle ran wild down here all over this state. Any kind of an excuse, these cattle would break and run. I've been in one stampede in Oklahoma, and we had 400, and it sounded just like a freight train, and the ground was actually vibrate. So, if you multiply that up into 2,500 running that way, it's hard to even comprehend what it's like. But yeah, it's a scary sucker. It's tough.
What really spooked the Longhorn and the cowboys was an eerie phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire.
They generate so much heat in a herd. Well, when it's thundering and lightning, that heat draws that lightning, and it actually light up on these horns, and they just dance around this blue fire, just dance all over these horns. And you can imagine how that would scare you, your horse, and all these cattle.
Overall, 10 million Texas cattle were driven to northern railheads on 4 major routes between 1865 and 1880. Kansas was the primary endpoint, but some herds went all the way to Canada. One reportedly grazed its way to New York. Tens of thousands of cowboys earning between $10 to $20 a month worked the trail drives, developing the skills, instincts, and lifestyle that would make them a national symbol. But they didn't always fit the popular 19th century stereotype. Between 15 and 30% of all cowboys were African American. Native Americans and Mexicans made up significant proportions as well. And with the exception of Texas, where carrying a gun was part of the culture, most cowboys didn't carry firearms, at least not while they worked.
Guns won the West, certainly one of the statements that stays with us. But the fact is, that really affected settlement of the West as far as the cowboy is concerned. It's not his gun, it's his raising of those cattle.
Cattle ranchers would raise herds in ever greater numbers after the demise of the open range. Up next, barbed wire and the incredible ranching empires of the West. 19th century cowboys had to use their $10 to $20 per month salary to buy their own gear, including a standard saddle that cost between $40 and $65. Cattle ranches will return on Modern Marvels. In 1904, Thomas Edison recorded these classic scenes of cattle ranchers at work. Rounding up the herd, roping, dragging, branding calves. Remarkably, just 20 years before Edison shot these scenes, cattle ranchers in the American West were still operating on the open range. raising cattle almost entirely without fences.
The open range had no boundaries. If you ran out of grass, water got short, you just got up and moved your herd somewhere else. And nobody'd say anything different. It was great. I mean, I'd love to be able to, you know, look across the fence where my neighbor's not using this country and say, man, I could use that better than he could. But it don't work that way.
With no fences to separate herds, branding played a crucial role in keeping track of who owned what cattle.
Texas in the 1830s and 40s, brands were used to mark cattle, usually on the left hip, as to who they belonged to. The process in the spring of branding cattle was a basic part of the cowboy's work.
Like old boy said, a brand is really the only return address on this cow, because you know where she came from.
Richard Chisholm came up with the first American brand in Texas in 1832. Another early Texas rancher, Samuel Maverick, became famous for his inability to brand his wild Longhorn. The unbranded cattle became known as Mavericks. Branding was not, however, a foolproof way of identifying cattle. Cattle rustlers specialized in ways of altering brands.
If you had a simple B brand for your last initial, you could put a curved mark below that so it became the rocking B, or you could put a straight mark below it so it became the bar B.
Needless to say, rustlers operated at their own peril, as Charlie Goodnight, a legendary Texas rancher, liked to point out.
Gee, so there has been a few rustlers that hung around here, but they didn't hang for long. So they strung them with a rope as soon as they caught them.
Brand books, which were widely circulated in the 1880s, were crucial in enabling ranchers to verify ownership. This one from Montana in 1886 identified brand, breed, and location of the brand on the animal for hundreds of herds. The open range shut down in the 1880s as severe winters wiped out wandering herds, and as the railroad extended further west and south, making the cattle drive unnecessary. In addition, cattle drivers, flush with cash after selling their herds, had begun buying up the land. In Texas especially, the rich pasture was dirt cheap.
This whole country is bringing 12, 14 cents an acre, and the guys that had any money was buying more of it. And of course, then the land started going up. Charlie Goodnight thought it was terrible when it got up to $1.50 an acre. He thought that was the most outrageous thing it ever was.
At 12 cents an acre, $1,200 got you 10,000 acres. At $1.50 an acre, that $1,200 only got you 800 acres. The 825,000-acre King Ranch in Kingsville, Texas, which is still intact and larger than the state of Rhode Island, was one of the first and greatest ranching empires.
It's our own world. The men that worked the land was brought out of Mexico by Captain King, and he needed some hands, and he went down there and moved a whole village of Mexican people. He said, I want every one of you, and y'all just come up here and work for us. And their descendants are still there today.
Giant ranches wouldn't have meant much without fencing. Until the 1870s, fencing made of wood or stone was too expensive to use over a large area. Barbed wire, introduced in 1873, revolutionized cattle ranching.
If we didn't have barbed wire, certainly something else would have to have developed, and it's unlikely that ranching as we know it would have been possible. There was a great industry in creating different patents for different designs of barbed wire, so that a few patents grow into a few dozen patents, grow into a few hundred patents, so that over time there have been at least a couple of thousand variations of barbed wire.
When it was first introduced, barbed wire was a tough sell, as an early patent holder named Joseph Gliddens found out.
Nobody believed that a little old wire would hold them old big Longhorn cattle, and it's just a waste of money and a waste of time. So he put this barbed wire around this pen, and he invited everybody to bring the wildest cattle, and he guaranteed they couldn't run them through this fence, that it'd hold them. bunch of them boys got in and got to hooping and hollering and popping bull whips and everything, and they couldn't make these steers go through, couldn't get them through. They even took torches at night and tried to run them through it. And that's how he started selling barbed wire.
Fencing the range profoundly transformed cattle ranching in America. In a sense, an age of innocence was over, an age in which ranching had been pretty much a matter of letting the cattle themselves do the job, eat their fill of free grass and reproduce themselves in large numbers. With fences, ranchers could begin thinking about improving the quality and even the genetic makeup of their herds. Almost immediately, new breeds were introduced, less hardy but tastier European breeds, like the Angus and the Hereford. Some ranches began creating their own breeds, ideally suited to a specific market and terrain. King Ranch introduced the Santa Gertrudis in 1920, a cross between the Brahman and the Shorthorn, and the first new breed of cattle to emerge in North America. Fences also made it possible to begin to manage the mating of livestock, using the best bulls to replenish the herd. Seed stock ranches, which specialized in raising genetically superior bulls for sale to other ranches, emerged in the 1920s. With the death of the open range, the push was on to improve cattle, make them bigger, meatier, hardier, tastier, and more profitable than ever. Most of all, 20th century cattle in the U.S. would have to learn how to gain weight, and fast. Up next, where cattle go for a final phase of feasting before the slaughterhouse. By 1927, the Texas Longhorn was an endangered species, with less than 200 left in the United States. But the Longhorn has made a comeback and now has a population of over 250,000. Cattle ranches will return on Modern Marvels. Cattle ranching with its cowboys, horses, and rangeland has a great image. But the same can hardly be said of red meat. Meat has been on the defensive for decades, first because of health concerns about animal fat, and more recently because of alarming outbreaks of E. coli, foot and mouth, and mad cow disease. In addition, animal rights activists have assailed the meat industry for alleged cruelty to cattle, while vegetarians claim that eating meat is wasteful, environmentally unsound, and even immoral. The inconsistency of meat has also given the industry a bad name.
There's been a lot of research that's been done that have shown that 1 out of 4 beef eating experiences is a bad one relative to tenderness. And that's too high. Those odds are no good for us.
Cattle ranchers who want to stay afloat in the 21st century are extremely serious about reorganizing their industry with efficiency and consistency of product uppermost in mind. To that end, some have banded together in hopes of winning back consumers with an actual brand of beef that comes with a promise.
Promise is we're guaranteeing tenderness. It's verified tender product. And it's a result of a lot of hard work that we've put together, tracking the cattle all the way through the entire system.
To deliver on that guarantee, ranchers have to evaluate their cattle from conception to carcass, in order literally to recreate the American cow. Through genetic weeding and selection, ranchers hope to create a kind of cow light, with less fat on the outside of the steak, but good interior marbling and flavor. A cow that delivers a consistent piece of meat. A uniform standard cow that has the perfect traits for efficient ranching.
The ideal type of cow is going to be one that makes money, and that can happen from a bunch of different ways.
Indeed, ranchers have taken away so much fat and added so much meat to the American cow that we're producing more pounds of beef today than we did in the mid-1970s, with about 20 million fewer head of cattle. As much as anything, cattle in today's American ranching business have to be good at eating and great at gaining weight, which is why 3/4 of all U.S. beef cattle spend the last few months of their lives being finished, to use the terminology of the trade, on a feedlot. In this feedlot in Cactus, Texas, 80,000 cattle are segregated by breed, age, and weight into 420 pens. Feedlots have emerged as a major sector of the cattle industry because feedlot cattle, which eat corn and grains instead of grass, put on pounds at twice the rate of ranch cattle.
We actually increase the overall supply of beef. If it weren't for the feed yards and the feeding industry in the United States today, we would literally have a beef shortage. We're almost doubling the pounds of beef produced through the feed yard operations.
In addition to bulking up quickly, grain-fed cattle also taste better, according to feedlot operators.
There's typically more marbling, which is the fat that's inside a nice steak that gives it the juiciness and the flavor that most consumers like.
There are 700 major feedlots in the United States, mostly in the Southwest and Midwest. Cactus Feeders, a Fortune 500 company that operates 9 yards in Texas and Kansas, is the largest feedlot conglomerate in the world.
We have a one-time capacity of 460,000 head. We turn that inventory about 2.5 times a year, so you can easily see where we feed in excess of 1 million cattle a year.
The first feedlots appeared in the Midwest in the 1950s, and they served 2 purposes: as a feeding pit stop for cattle en route to the slaughterhouse, and as a way of getting rid of surplus corn. By the 1960s, feedlots had evolved into sophisticated fattening farms, and to this day, nutritionists and veterinarians keep searching for the ultimate high-gain, low-cost diet. The cost-to-gain ratio is the key measure of feed yard efficiency. In other words, how much food does it take for a cow to gain a single pound? The answer varies from breed to breed, but on average, cattle eat between 25 and 30 pounds of feed a day, which results in a daily weight gain of 2 to 3 pounds. Every morning, feed engineers inspect each pen to see how well the cattle are gaining. They check out their feed history by computer and order up feed assignments for the day.
You can draw up on that laptop computer not only what that pen ate yesterday, but he can even have a 21-day determination or showing on that computer what it ate. And all this provides him with a guide on how many pounds of feed that he'd like to have the feed truck delivered to that particular pen.
A feed mill grinds out most of the rations used on the Cactus lot. 2 million pounds worth of corn, hay, and supplements every day. A Cactus research wing conducts daily drug and feeding tests on some 10,000 cattle. These new arrivals are receiving experimental hormone growth implants, which are stapled into their ear.
Typically, what you'll get with the implant like we're looking at is a response, anywhere from maybe 10 to 15% improvement in feed efficiency or average daily gain compared to what you'd have with a non-implanted animal.
The use of growth hormones is one of the most controversial practices in cattle ranching.
It's never been proved that there's ever been a residue, a hormone residue in beef as a result of using these growth promotants. They're extremely important from the standpoint of lowering our cost of production.
The hormones are all FDA approved, but many consumers are concerned about possible side effects. European countries have banned the import of American beef that has hormones. Feedlots have also been under fire for environmental reasons. The main complaint? Toxic runoff from the manure that piles up here. 80,000 head of cattle eating 25 to 30 pounds of feed a day will generate a lot of manure, and the runoff can seep into the water table. At Cactus, the runoff is collected and dumped into lagoons, then recycled to fertilize 2,000 acres of feedlot farmland. Meanwhile, about half of the dry manure is composted and distributed free to local farmers. Manure management inside the pens themselves is also important. As the dung accumulates, Cactus pen hands pile it up into mounds.
When we do have heavy snowfall or rain and so forth, which creates mud, that these animals, these mounds, very dry very quickly, and it gives the animals a dry place to lay down. Cattle in muddy conditions do not gain well. It raises the cost of gain, efficiency goes down, mainly because the cattle are very uncomfortable. And we want these cattle to be as comfortable as we possibly, can have it.
The slaughterhouse, of course, is the last stop in the cattle ranching story. The cattle are killed with a bolt gun that punches a retractable rod into their forehead. 99% of the animal is used commercially. Cattle byproducts are in everything from tires to asphalt to drywall. But slaughtering isn't the only thing that takes place here. Along with the carcass comes the carcass analysis.
We have carcasses that are graded by USDA inspectors at our plants for a yield grade and a quality grade. A yield grade looks at the percentage of fat versus muscle, and a quality grade gives you some indication of eating quality for that steak.
For ranchers like Rob Brown, carcass analysis is like a final report card, full of data that enables him to figure out which cows and which bulls are delivering the goods. The brave new world of cattle ranching, with its focus on recreating cattle to meet industrial and consumer needs, could take a quantum leap in the not-so-distant future, with the controversial development of cloning.
If we ever got to the point where cloning was economically efficient, that would be one way to have very consistent products, because you'd have animals that were genetically identical.
American scientists have already cloned some 250 cows, and it's possible that one day the entire livestock of the United States, if not the world, will be replicated from a handful of animals. Yes, there is something unsettling about that scenario. But even if cloning does take over, ranchers will probably still have to round up, rope, and brand their cattle like they've been doing for centuries. Up next, a ranch in Texas where cowboys work their herd the old-fashioned way. Cows have stomachs designed to digest grass, not grain, and half the bicarbonate of soda in America is consumed by feedlot cattle that suffer from chronic indigestion. Cattle ranches will return on Modern Marvels. Helicopters play an important role in contemporary ranching, especially on really large spreads like the 825,000-acre King Ranch in South Texas. King Ranch is so big that it's hard for cowboys to know where the 60,000 head of cattle are, and they sometimes depend on helicopters to steer them to the right grazing area. At 180,000 acres, the Pitchfork Ranch in West Texas is also pretty big. But you won't see helicopters or sperm banks or even telephone wires strung across this 120-year-old spread. You will see cowboys on horseback, ranching in pretty much the same manner as their forebears did a century ago.
Here, a cowboy is a cowboy. He's not asked to go out and build fence. He's not asked to go out and get on a tractor and plow. He's strictly hard to cowboy. That means he's a horseback every day.
I think a cowboy should look like a cowboy. I really do. If they don't look like a cowboy, they aren't interested in the cowboy tradition. They can certainly go somewhere and get a better paying job. So if they're here, they're doing it because they like it.
It's early May, time for the spring roundup. At 6 in the morning, a dozen cowboys saddle up and ride to a remote section of the ranch. A police siren of all things serves as a feeding cue, and the cattle slowly emerge from the brush. The cattle approach warily, their natural distrust of humans at war with their desire for feed. On the horizon, the cowboys line up carefully, far enough away from the cattle so as not to scare them off. At a signal, they move in, driving the cattle towards a nearby pen.
It's a game against the cowboy on a horse, on an animal, trying to pin another animal, and that other animal doesn't want to pin. And so you drop off the cowboys on the line, say we're pins in that direction. And once the last cowboy's dropped off, he hoots back to everybody else, and we start at one time. And we sweep that pasture just like you would a floor.
This deceptively simple act of driving cattle in a given direction is in some ways the most basic and the most dangerous part of cattle ranching.
You got no heifer or steer break out, the cow, you've got to bring her back running, full speed, you know, across no pasture or something, step in a hole or horse stumbles. There's big cowboys killed.
In the pen, the cowboys quickly set up the branding fire and take their positions. In addition to branding, the calves will be inoculated with an antiviral medication. They'll also have the tip of one ear sliced off for individual ID purposes. And the males will be castrated.
Some pretty frail type guys really can flank calves good. It's more timing than it is brute strength. Obviously, some people are better at it. You start early in the season, and these guys get winded pretty quick, and then they're pretty tough right now, even though we saw some calves that didn't go down just as pretty as what we wanted.
The maneuvers are done as quickly as possible to lessen the stress and suffering of the animal.
Guy on the head, he lifts the head up. The guy crop off the ear on the bottom, lifts the head up. If I'm there with the branding iron, I've kind of got priority because the branding iron's getting cold.
The males are castrated on American ranches because castrated bulls or steers don't produce testosterone, a male hormone that stimulates muscle growth and toughens the flesh. Without testosterone, the steer's flesh marbles, producing a more tender, higher-grade steak. The cattle are dehorned to reduce injuries during fights and also to fit more animals into the trucks that will take them to the feed yard and the slaughterhouse.
It's gonna be blood, so if you're squeamish on blood or smell smoke, that hair burning's old Brandon, that hair burning's a different smell. It lingers with you for a long time.
The sound that the calves and the way it looks, I think, is more of a distress from being separated and the kind of the shock. They think, well, the predator has them and maybe they're going to eat them up, instead of just to give them a few shots and a little pain for a minute.
They run right back to the mamas and everything's fine. Sure, it hurts, son. We've had a tetanus shot, we've had our tonsils out. It's for the better health of the animal. To me, an animal's put on this earth to eat or it wouldn't be made out of meat. And it's just something that needs to be done. It's just the way of life.
The way of life is exactly what draws cowboys to this work.
The money's not there. You're not going to get rich. We do it because we like the outdoor life. We like working with stock. To me, I love working with good horses. It's not a routine job. It's not something you do the same thing every day. It's always a little different.
Long hours and, a lot of dirty work, but, there ain't nothing better. A lot of people grow up wishing they was cowboying and, doing it.
Riding the range on a ranch like Pitchfork, it's easy to lose sight of the other phases of 21st century cattle ranching, of the feed yard and the sperm bank and cloning. But for all its pastoral traditions and Western charm, cattle ranching is an industry in transition, an industry in which the future promises to be very different from the past. To fertility pills and embryo transplants that enable a single cow to conceive as many as 36 calves. All this in an effort to make cattle ranching as efficient as an assembly line and to woo consumers with consistently tender steaks. In cattle ranching, the Old West is butting up hard against the 21st century bottom line.
Used to be, you'd put a cow and bull together, have a calf, sell the calf, make money. It's not like that anymore. It's pretty high tech. You got to do it correctly or you're out of business.
Meet Broadway, a prize Simmental bull with the kind of genes that cattle ranchers around the world have come to covet. It's a legendary part of the American past, the job that created the cowboy. It's the heart of the food chain, the business of eating and being eaten. It's as old as farming and as current as cloning. An industry in which a single bull can sire 100,000 calves. Now, cattle ranches on Modern Marvels. The image of cattle ranching in America is still a traditional one, full of open spaces, big skies, large herds, and cowboys. But cattle ranching today isn't really about cowboys and countryside. It's about meat, the very serious and intensely competitive business of putting some 25 billion pounds of steak, barbecue, and hamburger on the national grill each year. Never have the economic stresses and demands been so great. Never have ranchers been forced to speed up and streamline the very cycles of nature, to push their cattle quite so hard, to grow them so big, so fast, so meaty, so uniform, using everything from sonograms that analyze the genetic quality of an animal's flesh, to computer chips that carry growth and weight statistics stretching back for generations. Broadway is a seed stock bull, which means he isn't destined for the slaughterhouse like most cattle. Instead, he'll spend his life siring hundreds, perhaps thousands, and possibly tens of thousands of calves. Calves with the right stuff from both a consumer and an industrial point of view. Broadway won't actually mate with tens of thousands of cows. Because of his superior genetic makeup, his semen will be collected and sold in straws over the internet for $200 apiece, and then used via artificial insemination in ranches as far away as South America, Europe, and Australia.
This is a good example of a high-quality red Brangus bull. This particular bull has been leased by American Breeder Service. There's been a tremendous amount of semen collected on this bull, and the semen sales on this bull look very good in the future.
Top bulls can generate as much as $150,000 a year in semen sales. Super bulls with extraordinarily desirable traits can sire upwards of 100,000 calves, so many that they'll actually alter the genetic makeup of their breed. In other words, the entire breed will take on the traits of a single sire.
You just don't hardly pick up an Angus pedigree today that doesn't go back to the Traveler bull or the Scotch Cap bull. I mean, those bulls were used extremely heavy for many, many years.
An increasingly important part of cattle ranching in the 21st century takes place in the lab, not the ranch. Elgin Breeders in Elgin, Texas, has been collecting and storing bull semen since 1954.
This is the semen storage room. There's approximately 5 million straws of semen in the